So good day. I will be discussing Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus. So to start, Albert Camus is an existentialist, and existentialism is the belief that emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent in determining their own development through acts of free will. And in the reading, both Sartre and Camus are existentialists, but with different views, especially in the concept of the absurd. While Sartre believes that absurdity belongs to the world prior to the activity of the consciousness, Camus, on the other hand, believes that the absurd is a direct consequence of the absence of God. It is the discrepancy between human aspirations and the world. It is the tension between the man's desire to clarity and meaning and the indifference of the world in its silence. Prior to the discussion of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus explained the few concepts. The human condition is said to be an experience where one might suffer with the certainty of death at the end, wherein this death is the fate that humans refuses to accept as reasonable. And again, for the concept of the absurd, it is the contradiction of the world in our mind, the world that we want, the ideal world, and the world as is, the real world, silent and indifferent. But Camus also mentioned lucidity, which is the clarity and the courage that the mind refuses all comforting illusions and self-deception, which Camus described as hope. The myth of Sisyphus is a story of a Greek man who tricked the gods to escape death, and as punishment, he has to push a boulder on top of a mountain only to watch it roll down after reaching the summit, where the cycle goes on endlessly. It is a potent image of futility. But Camus asks to imagine Sisyphus happy, for he has lived his life. He accepted his punishment and pushing the rock up the summit again and again with a smile. The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus is divided into 4 chapters: Absurdity and Suicide, Absurd Wall, the Philosophical Suicide, and the Absurd Freedom. For the first chapter, The Absurdity and Suicide, Camus described it as the only truly philosophical problem. That suicide is the only truly philosophical problem. That judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. There could be multiple reasons for suicide, such as personal tragedies, sorrows, as well as small insignificant things. But these do not exactly pinpoint the cause of suicide. But regardless, one is certain that suicide is a confession that life is ridiculous and meaningless, that committing suicide means admitting that existence itself is meaningless, and the absurd is the reason behind it. So, if we know that life is meaningless, why do people not just kill themselves? Well, there are 3 reasons. One is because people develop the habit of living before they develop logic. We first learn to live our lives before we learn to have consciousness, which awakens the understanding of the absurd. The second is the body is first developed to live. We experience life, and this causes us to be addicted to life itself, giving us illusions of meaning, which goes to the third reason, hope. Hope gives a sense of life, a sense of meaning, and sense of purpose, the thought that makes people think it is their duty to look and understand the meaning of life, and we hope that life itself is not meaningless. So, the question becomes, should we live? If so, if life has no meaning, then how Should we live our life in the face of absurdity? Well, Camus arrived that there could only be two options, that there is two answers. Yes and no, where yes is to hope and live, while no is to die and commit suicide. But Camus also say that there should be a third option. Aside from yes and no, it should not end with just having to choose either of the two. And now we go to the second chapter, the absurd wall. In this chapter, it discusses the absurd through how it is felt, that this feeling of absurdity comes in our everyday lives, and to better understand absurdity is to understand how it is felt. For deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. And this absurdity can be felt in two ways, through emotional and through intellectual levels. In the emotional level, the absurd is in the arrival of the why in the mechanical life. It is the questioning of the meaning of doing the mundane task of everyday lives, bringing weariness of meaninglessness of things. It is also in the consciousness of the nudity of the world, that the world itself lacks meaning the moment the illusory meaning that we assign to things is lost. For the intellectual level, the absurd is in the process of distinguishing what is true from what is false. That what it discovers first on the reflection of itself is a contradiction. That what one first believed as true could be false, and what once was false can be true. And the cycle goes on. This appetite for clarity is the mind's deepest desire. To understand the world for a man is to reduce it to the human through a unified truth. But achieving a unified truth is impossible, for finding a rational and this irrational universe is impossible, and human knowledge is nothing but fundamentally limited. Even science is reduced to nothing but describing, for it can never fully understand how everything works, since reality itself is multi-layered, and this is the absurd in the intellectual level. To explain the absurd, it is the contradiction between the man and the universe, that the man attempts to find meaning, while the universe responds in silence. The absurd can only exist when we wish for clarity in this irrational universe, and it is what can help us understand the choices of those people whether to live, to hope, or to die, to commit suicide. The third chapter is the philosophical suicide. Philosophical suicide is the act of subverting the absurd, evading it, rising above it, or ignoring it. It is in the reconciling of the conflict with the absurd, and even in committing suicide. Thus, there is no escape in the absurd. The only thing one can do is to find joy and not excuses in our absurd existence. Lastly, the last chapter, or the fourth and last chapter, is about the absurd freedom. It discusses how everything is uncertain, but for the absurdist, uncertainty is unacceptable. The only thing that counts for them is what they know, what is certain, what they cannot deny, and what they cannot escape. And that is the absurd, which is the only thing that is certain. And the way to accept the absurd is not through embracing it, but rather through persisting. And according to Camus, there are three ways on how to live with absurdity, through the three consequences of persisting against the absurd, through freedom, passion, and revolt. Freedom, knowing whether or not a man is free does not interest me. I can experience only my own freedom. And this freedom is defined not in choosing a role, For roles can be restricting since it limits you from what you can and can't do. Freedom is about on the freedom of the now and not on the freedom of the future. The perversion of hope and future means an increasing in the man's availability through understanding that there is no future and only death. If the absurd cancels all of my chances of eternity, it restores and magnifies, on the other hand, the freedom of action. For passion, if I admit that my freedom has no meaning except in relations to its limited fate, then I must say that what counts is not the best living, but the most living. And this is where living in quantity, not quality, enters. It is about living in quantity because living life in quality is subjective, but living life in quantity is making the most out of what life can offer. One should not limit one's life based on the subjective best life, but should live with multiple experiences of different things that bring happiness to the person. The absurd lives in the present, and living with passion in the present moment, keeps the absurd alive. And lastly, to revolt. I rebel, therefore I exist. The absurd is something that we should not embrace, but rather revolt against. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived at the better if it has no meaning at all. It is accepting that we do not need meaning to live. The contradiction between the man and the universe and the tension of the absurd brings us something to live for. Defiance, or to rebel, is to give life meaning. To live is to be a rebel of the absurd. By the mere activity of the consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse to suicide. But it is not to rebel to win against the absurd. The consequence of revolting against the absurd is to rebel knowing that we will lose.